Hello, SBAM members and other interested parties, or I guess interesting parties. I hope you're interesting. I'm Brian Kelly. I'm the CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Miller. I'm SBAM's Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Communications. Thanks for joining us. Before we get started, I'd like to welcome our new member of the week, Lansing Uniform Company. Lansing Uniform Company is owned by James Downs, so welcome to you and your team. And of course, we're able to welcome this member on behalf of our sponsor, Consumers Credit Union. You can learn all about Consumers Credit Union at consumerscu.org. So Brian, before we got started today, or before the show started, we got a breaking news email about the 7th Congressional District. So we know Senator Stabenow isn't running for re-election, and Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin has announced her candidacy. But now this kind of opens up the race for this 7th Congressional District seat. So let us know what's happening there.
Yeah, the 7th Congressional District in Michigan in this last election, when it was Alyssa Slotkin versus Tom Barrett, was one of the most expensive, most watched races in the entire country. And so the fact that it is apparently opening up with Alyssa Slotkin deciding to run for United States Senate means that it's an open seat, this very competitive kind of purple seat, one that is considered kind of a swing seat, will be open. Immediately, Tom Barrett, so the candidate from before against Alyssa Slotkin, a Republican candidate, announced. And on the other side of the ticket, the early action was an exploratory committee announced by Lansing Mayor Andy Shore, but he announced this actually just today, although it kind of came out over the weekend, that he was not going to run. He decided against running. And so it begs the question with this race that's one of the most competitive in the entire country, who might line up on the Democratic side of the ticket. And so a few names that are out there today include Curtis Hertel, who is the state senator for the Lansing, East Lansing area for the last 8 years. His father was actually Speaker of the House back in the day, but Curtis is now the legislative director for Governor Whitmer. So his name is being floated around, and so is Barb Byram, who is the Ingham County clerk and former member of the House of Representatives. Barb's mother actually was the minority leader in the House of Representatives until 2006. And so two families with a long political history that are being discussed. Neither has announced their intentions yet, but there's also some other possibilities that could come out of that district. Like, for example, Senator Sarah Anthony, who is the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, who was more recently a state representative in the Lansing area. So I expect this one to be, again, a marquee type of a race. And the real question is, will Tom Barrett sail to the Republican nomination, and will there be a big contest on the Democratic side, regardless of how that turns out? I would expect this to be a major battleground seat in the next election in 2024. And given how close the margins are in the House, seats like this, I think, will continue to get a lot of attention.
All right. Let's talk about unemployment. So SBAM had convened a task force in order to contribute to the Unemployment Modernization Workgroup that the UIA is doing. So give us a little update on how that's going.
Yeah, we're really excited to see that the unemployment agency, the Unemployment Insurance Agency, is doing a modernization project to improve the unemployment system, which is sorely needed. We know that the computer system, or the operating system itself, is going to be outsourced in the future to Deloitte, and the features of the program and potentially the way that the whole system works could be changed. And SBAM is part of a work group that's working directly with the agency over the next several months in order to just speak into the needs of small business owners. A lot of other stakeholders at the table as well that are contributing to this process. We decided to form our own task force to solicit information from from a wide variety of members and speak into the system. And our first step, our initial findings, some goals that we would like to see that the modernization project achieve in the future. I thought we'd just give a quick overview. This work will continue for months, but it starts with accountability. One of the main things that we heard from our members is they'd like to see more accountability for who is eligible for unemployment benefits. If a person turns down a job, if a person doesn't show up for an interview, if a person is a no-show for the first day of work, there needs to be a way to communicate that into the unemployment system, even in cases when that person is not drawing against your business, that business owners would still like to be able to tell the agency, hey, this person's not drawn on my account right now, but I want to let you know that I gave them a job offer and they turned it down or they didn't show up. Because that goes to the eligibility of the individual. So accountability for eligibility was a really important factor. The next is efficiency in dealing with the unemployment system itself. The difficulty with the computer system, the ability of third-party payroll entities to fully access the computer system as opposed to being required to use the paper system sometimes adds some inefficiency into the system. Being able to talk to a person to resolve issues and to resolve eligibility issues before a person starts drawing benefits is some of the examples in that efficiency category. Then the next overarching goal or principle that was identified by our work group is to have a system that does not discourage work. It needs to encourage work. During the pandemic, we definitely saw a period of time when some people were better off not finding a job, and that was thought to be very, very harmful to the workforce development needs of the economy. And then the final big overarching goal was to prevent harm caused by long-term unemployment. A lot of research and studies that show how harmful it is for a person to be unemployed for long periods of time. And so sometimes if you help a person too much, you're actually hurting them long term. And speaking into the system with that type of a mindset, that an expectation of a return to work as soon as possible is in most cases the best option when it comes to that person's long-term economic health.
It really is a great report, and we will be releasing it in the coming weeks. So watch for that. So we had such a full show last Thursday that we didn't really get a chance to kind of cover where right to work stands. So could you give us a brief update on that situation?
Right to work has now passed the House and the Senate. When it passed the Senate last week, it passed with some amendments from the way the House had passed the bill. And so those need to be rectified still, but they're relatively minor in terms of the differences between the two chambers. The House could just concur and it will be done and on its way to the governor. So expect that to be one way or another. I expect that to be wrapped up this week. And so it's, I basically call it a done deal. We definitely oppose the legislation to repeal right to work, just on the overall impact that it has on the climate in Michigan and how much better Michigan did in the last 10 years since right to work passed as compared to the 10 years before, in literally every way that you can measure. But there's but this is one that was really kind of a foregone conclusion. It was one that they had the numbers to pass it. It was pretty clear with the new majorities in the legislature that it was going to pass. So we're not surprised by it, even if disappointed. I wouldn't be surprised though if you also saw a follow-up, potentially a ballot initiative on right to work that comes up in response to the action that the legislature is taking now, especially once the governor signs it into law, and the governor will sign it into law. That has been communicated very, very clearly. So right to work will be repealed in Michigan. It'll be the first state to take an action of this nature in all of America for 60 years. So Michigan is kind of uniquely going it alone on this policy, or on the backtrack of the policy.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks for that update. Let's talk about another tax issue, actually. The legislature had some trouble assembling votes to pass the economic development package for Ford that we've covered. And so it kind of opened up some opportunities to include a fix on a tax issue that's important to SBAM. What is that tax issue?
The tax issue is the way that Treasury had changed its posture in 2019 to through audits of sales and use taxes to start assessing sales and use tax on installation and delivery services, particularly on furniture. And so what ended up happening is furniture companies had believed, according to a previous revenue bulletin from Treasury, that while the sale of furniture to a final user is subject to sales tax, that we don't have a service sales tax in Michigan that applies to delivery services or to installation services, and therefore that portion of the transaction was not taxed. The Treasury changed their posture, at least their aggressiveness. They say that they didn't really change the policy. It's always been this way, but it was never a problem before. And then audits started turning up big tax liabilities to businesses in this line of work, and it created quite an upheaval in that industry. So that issue has been around since then, and there've been efforts to try to fix it through the legislative process. And Matt Hall, is the minority leader in the House of Representatives, really did see this as an opportunity to insert this issue. As long as they're having trouble getting enough votes, eventually they were going to get the rest of that Ford deal done. He would be able to insert into the process this tax fix, and it was agreed to. It's about a $65 million impact, mostly paid by small businesses, and that will now be relieved through this legislation, including those who were previously assessed through audits. So it fixes the problems in the past, and it fixes it going forward. Now you might add, why is this considered a big issue to small business? SBAM has a long-standing opposition to a sales tax on services. The service industry is mainly dominated by small businesses, and all kinds of service industries are. And so there's a wide interest in this. And the idea of state government, without even a new law passing, kind of creeping into the territory of reinterpretation or more aggressive implementation of tax law, taxing additional $65 million in services. If that went unchecked, then it's reasonable to assume the next time there's a downturn or the state's short on cash, that it could take more liberties and trying to pull in more services. So we thought it was pretty important to nip this one in the bud. And so it's why it's been on our list for the last few years. Almost got it through at the end of last year, but it just didn't. A lot of stuff fell apart at the end of last year. And but it got done this time. And my understanding is that the governor has agreed to it, and the bills are on their way to her desk.
All right. So there's also a bill passing through the system that would add additional appointees to the strategic fund. This fund is responsible for economic development awards through the MEDC. So why are they changing the makeup of this board now?
Another thing that the legislature was looking for, particularly the minority parties in the legislature, was to have some appointments to the strategic fund board that were nominated by those legislative leaders, the minority party legislative leaders. So this, I think, is also a direct response to the economic. There's been a lot of economic development dollars for these targeted incentives for the bigger corporations, and that the idea of having, if those allocations need to be approved by the legislature, legislative leaders are saying, we'd like to have nominations to sit on that board as well, so that there could be another kind of check in the system or more input in the system across the entire political spectrum and across both branches of government, the executive and the legislative branch. So my understanding on that is that has been accepted as well in that the governor is expected to sign it. So that legislation is making its way through the process and appears to be moving without any serious opposition.
All right. Earlier today, you and I were talking before the show, and you mentioned there's these certain risks of instability that may impact the economy, and they're not necessarily under control of individual business owners or people. So can you break those down for our members? I think there's three in particular that you could cover.
Yeah, there are some pretty big environmental issues that I'm concerned about in terms of the operating environment, things that you really can't, there's nothing any individual business can do to make it go this way or that way. So just this upheaval makes sense to just be ready for in case it does impact your business. The first is the tensions between the US and China. So the geopolitical nature of that relationship has been strained over the years, but it seems to be entering a new type of a phase right now. And as the president of China went into his third term and gave some speech, reorganized government, the speech that the language coming out of China is uncharacteristically pointed. Usually they're very, very reserved in criticism, particularly of the West. And so one of the statements that caught my attention, just a quote here, Western countries led by the United States have implemented all-around containment, encirclement, and suppression of China, which has brought unprecedented severe challenges to our country's development, end quote. That's pointing direct, naming the United States and pointing directly at Western countries. That's unusually direct language that you wouldn't normally see from China. But if you think of the backdrop, they've had economic challenges that are largely of their own making with the way that they had pursued zero COVID type policies for longer than anybody else in the world. And there's a lot of economic unrest and also economic damage caused by those policies and how long they lingered past everybody else in the world. So there's more dissatisfaction within China, and I think it was kind of convenient to point to the United States and the West, but there's more than that happening there. You also have the Chinese support for Russia, which is causing tensions with the Russia-Ukraine war. And how far does China go to support Russia in that endeavor is one of the things that's impacting the nature of this relationship. You also had the U.S. Energy Department, the conclusion that an accidental laboratory leak in China was the most likely cause of the coronavirus pandemic, something that China was deeply offended by, even though there's more evidence for that than any other thing. But but it wasn't a high degree of confidence in the fact that from the Energy Department, and the fact that the United States still published the report without a high degree of confidence is something that's caused some additional tension. Spy balloon across America, that is another issue. And then also in the Philippines, the country's new president is restoring defense ties with the United States, which is creating additional tensions. And that's not the whole list of things, but if you start to get a sense that there's a lot of tension building between the two countries, the two largest economies in the world, and that's bound to have some economic implications. A few other things to mention. This week, it is widely believed that there will be criminal charges filed against former President Trump. And there's already kind of political unrest. That feels like it could be a very tumultuous time period in terms of additional political unrest. And what that looks like, who knows? Nothing like this has ever happened before. And so the idea of an actual arrest happening of a former U.S. president is not something that there's a playbook for. And what I think is going to make it a little bit more complicated is that the legal strategies used to justify the charges have never been used before. There's a brand new legal playbook for charges, and it's going to I think it's going to give an audience. Some people will say, hey, the law is the law and let this play out. And other people are going to say, look, they're inventing new things and this is purely political. And that divide could definitely impact things in a negative way. Governing is already pretty difficult. I think that the divide could get a little deeper. And then the final thing is just the international ripple impacts of the lack of confidence in the overall financial system that doesn't seem to recognize how localized some of the challenges are. So Credit Suisse is the big news today. Another Swiss bank, UBS, is going to be buying Credit Suisse for $3.2 billion, which is not much. Okay, so that was a deal that was really accommodated, one might even say forced, by the Swiss government, but that's a huge bank that has international ramifications. And even though they're doing it because they don't want a particular bank that has not been well managed for many, many years, they don't want that bank to go under. The way that this transaction is happening, it could create questions in terms of the overall valuations of banks. If Credit Suisse is only worth that amount, which is a lot less than what you would have thought just a few months ago, then it could cause a lack of investor confidence elsewhere in the banking industry. They're also wiping out about $17 billion worth of bonds, which facilitates a more clean transaction in the merger of these two banks, or the acquisition of the bank. But also, I think, puts another question of how solid bonds are that are placed with banks, or that where the creditor is a bank, or where the debtor, I should say, is a bank. So that's while they're taking very aggressive action, trying to stabilize that particular bank. What I'm concerned about is the notion of this ripple impact of lack of confidence, which there is no logical reason to apply to the U.S. banking system. Because if you were to look at what's happened here, you have the Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, one that was a tech startup and heavily invested in the tech industry bank with a risk profile that was highly, highly unusual. And the other one, which had a lot of customers, depositors, and borrowers that were tied into the crypto industry. Both tech and crypto cash can go up and down really quick, and banks can have liquidity problems. At a time of rising interest rates, those risk profiles were particularly troubling, and depositors lost confidence. There was a run on those banks, and so that it created a scenario where those banks were taken over by the regulators. But they're not representative of other banks. There are a handful of other banks that have similar, of the hundreds and hundreds of banks across the country that have risk profiles like that. It is not indicative of the U.S. industry. And so as I look at these indications from, whether it's the geopolitical stresses with Ukraine and Russia, and the pressures that it puts on the U.S.-China relationship, and political instability here in our country, along with people drawing conclusions about confidence in banks that really aren't rooted in the inherent strength of the vast majority of the banking system in the United States. All of this feels like kind of shifting positions, and it makes sense to really. I mean, it's not anything that any individual small business can do to affect these items, except for to think through, what are your ripcord plans? What if something bad were to happen? What if the market turned really quickly? What if the economy turned more quickly than what it seems like it will right now, as it seems like we might be kind of heading toward a soft landing? What if that was different? Just to kind of game through these things, and then and use that as a data point, not the data point, a data point in your work moving forward. So just an eyes wide open thing where we've got challenges and environmental issues and questions that seem a little bit more complicated today than even just say a month ago. But it doesn't mean that your anything about your plans needs to change. But these are important information points to take into consideration as you're moving forward with the plans for your business.
All right, that really is a good segue into Data Monday.
All right, let's do a roundup here of Data Monday, which I'm going to start with the inflation, a look at inflation, and these are the monthly numbers. So if you were to look at up in blue, you're looking at the consumer price index and the growth month over month. So oftentimes we're going to look at in a minute the year over year, which is the one you see on the news, but month over month, prices rose 0.4%. So that's the monthly increase. But if you look at the core inflation, this is the one that I was talking about last week, where there's more of an upward trend. So there's not an upward trend, discernible upward trend in headline inflation. But when it comes to core inflation, yes, it's less than a year ago, definitely less than a year ago. But in the last few months, you've seen it inching up a bit. And that's what is, I think, undoubtedly frustrating the Federal Reserve. Here's what it looks like, though, annualized. So if you look at headline inflation in the blue and the core inflation in the orange, you'll see that both are going down year over year, but the headline has come down pretty close actually to the core inflation, which is because the commodity prices have really started to come down. So this is the one where this one would give you a little more confidence, but when you look under the hood a little bit, the core inflation gives you a little bit less confidence. If you want a real deep dive into why I think that this is still generally headed in the right direction, take a look at a long form discussion on the economic environment that we posted last week. That shows that I still think inflation wise we're generally headed in the right direction. Just the order of dominoes that are falling. This is the reason why I think what the politicians really tend to miss when they're bragging about U.S. economic performance and saying, wages have risen more in the last year than they have in a long time, but not real wages. Wages minus inflation, it's negative 1.9, and this is why there's while the politicians say, "Hey, general public, you never had it so good." General public is saying, well, I've got less money left over at the end of the day, and it's because real wages have fallen because of inflation. This is the reason why inflation needs to be a top priority in getting it under control, even if it does soften the economy. I know that's really counterintuitive to think of it that way, but that when inflation is growing fast, the economy can never catch up to it. Wages are always chasing that number. Just by definition, it's how it works. And then we've got some survey updates from the National Federation of Independent Businesses. The top businesses problems facing businesses, inflation, still number one. That's the blue line. And then quality of labor being number two. And so the number 1, 2, 3, and 4, the order of these have not actually changed in a little while since inflation took over as number one. We also see the compensation index, the amount small businesses are paying in real time is actually kind of spiked back up, which would have been a concern for the Federal Reserve as they look at interest rates. But if you look at compensation plans for the future, you see those kind of generally still trending downward. So mixed signals there. And then job openings that are described as hard to fill. Not surprisingly, when you saw wages, real-time wages from small businesses going up, the jobs hard to fill also kind of spiking up last month too, after it had been trending down a little bit. But hiring plans for the future, those long-term plans, that is still a clear downward trend. So still not low, not considered low historically, but I think as all of these things, we talked about these geopolitical forces and instability out there. I think that there's just kind of a general tightening, a general pulling back where small businesses are more often today saying, you know what, I'm going to hold back on some of the aggressiveness of plans for the future because of this instability. In terms of prices, small businesses that are charging higher prices and those who are planning to charge higher prices in the next 3 months, both of those continue to come down. And the nature of this index doesn't let us separate out goods versus services. But if it's anything like the consumer price index, they're moving in different directions. Price of goods is coming down, price of services is still going up. So that's the Data Monday for today, and a lot of stuff that we covered. I'm going to do a longer form presentation coming up here pretty soon on just the banking industry and a little bit under the hood of how what's happening there and why it's happening the way it is. And my goal is to maybe instill a little bit of confidence in the US banking system, that a lot of this instability you're seeing out there is not indicative of your local bank, is not indicative of the US banking system. And I want to share why I have that confidence.
All right, well, we'll look forward to watching that video. I do want to let everyone know we have 2 webinars this week related to cybersecurity. So you can check those out at sbam.org/events. I think one is Wednesday and one is Thursday. And then Thursday afternoon, we will be at Washtenaw Community College for our Ann Arbor Owner to Owner event. And don't worry, if you are a Spartan fan, you can still come to the Owner to Owner event. It ends at 6 o'clock. So you can make it home in time to catch that game. But just visit sbam.org/events to see what else we have coming up this week and into April. Have a great week, and we will see you back here Thursday at 3 p.m.
Thanks, everybody. See you on Thursday.